off by asking, did everybody see the study guide that I posted for exam 2?
Yes.
Yes, we did? Okay. If you haven't seen it, I highly encourage you to go on Blackboard under assignments. It should be in there where all your lectures are. And definitely look at that, go through that, and write out the answers to those questions or find the answers to those questions, because that is going to help you immensely on the exam. However, with that, I will say do not solely rely on that study guide. So there are a lot of questions on there that will really help you on the test, but that doesn't mean that those are the only questions that are going to possibly show up on the test. So make sure that you're also kind of going through the lectures as well. So I kind of wanted to just start off with if anybody has kind of worked on that study guide, if you have any questions like that you want me to clear up or that you want me to answer before we get started. And then we'll kind of see how we're going to go with the review from there. If there are certain lectures that you want me to kind of go over, certain points or certain things you don't feel like you get, you all can kind of just guide me on what you want to go over. And if not, then I'll just kind of go through the lectures really quick again and kind of try to point out things that I think are important. So try to be talkative. I know like a lot of you don't like to really speak up in class, but this is your review. So this is your opportunity to ask me questions, to get information about what you need to know on the test, and for me to clarify anything you don't understand. So please take advantage of it. We have a good bit of time, so we should be able to get quite a bit covered. So with that, has anybody worked on the study guide? Does anybody have any questions about the study guide? Anything you weren't really sure what the answer was? Don't be shy. Feel free to speak up. Nothing?
Yes, I didn't know what this was there. I saw it, but I haven't learned it.
Okay, that's fine. So if you haven't had a chance to do it yet, that's perfectly okay. And it's not required. Like, I'm not making you turn it in as an assignment or anything. It's literally, I just made it to help y'all because it is some tough material. So I kind of wanted to guide you in what you're studying. So if nobody has any specific questions, then I'm going to kind of pull up each lecture and go through them kind of fast and maybe point out some key things that I'd really like you to know. So in order to get through all of them, it is going to be pretty fast. So if there's something that you don't understand and I'm going too fast, please stop me and ask me to kind of further explain. And I'm going to kind of ask you questions as we go through so that I can kind of gauge what you know and how fast I can move on. So the faster you answer me, the more material we're going to get through for the review. Sound good? Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Does it have like the window, do you just see the PowerPoint?
Oh, basically. And we see a little bit of the small screens of everybody else off on the side.
That's what I was going to ask, because let me try to just share it with PowerPoint then, so you don't see that. Because I was doing the share desktop thing. So I was wondering if you saw that. Okay. Is that better?
No, it's basically the same thing. The other thing just sits on top. The other window.
Gotcha. So do you still see like the little video screens now?
Yes, but it's free floating. We don't see yours. We see our own.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Oh, well, you see it from your computer. Okay. Not
yes.
Okay. Gotcha. Because it's kind of like blocking just a little bit of my PowerPoint. That's why I asked, because I didn't want to like block it for you all.
Which you can slide it out of the way if you need to.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of move it over a little bit, but okay. All right. So the cattle lecture, I know y'all watched a recording, so I didn't give it in person. So if you did have any questions, feel free to stop me. I'm just going to kind of go through and hit some highlights here. So with cattle, I know in that lecture we talked about the two main species of cattle, and those are the Bos taurus and the Bos indicus. And the Bos taurus are typically European breeds, and the indicus are Indian breeds, which you can kind of see in the name there. And so one thing that I really want you to understand is that there are two main species of cattle that we talked about, and these are the species. Later in the lecture, we also talked about the two different breeds, which were continental versus British breeds. So make sure you know the difference, that these are the two main species, and then those are the two main breeds, types of breeds. Because some people kind of get confused on that, and it's easy to get that confused. So those are the two main species. There is complete fertility between the two species, so you could do crossbreeding between them. So then we kind of talked about different traits of both of the species. So the Bos taurus are maternal and or terminal breeds. So they have really good production in temperate climates and really good carcass traits. So those carcass traits would be your marbling, which is your intermuscular fat, and tenderness and yield. So Bos indicus, on the other side of things, are more heat tolerant, and they have increased disease and parasite resistance. They also have better production in subtropical climates, obviously because they're very tolerant to heat. And so a couple of their negative attributes are that they are a little older when they reach puberty, and their carcass quality is not as good. So definitely know what the two different species are, and kind of be able to tell me like one or two things about them. So be able to kind of tell me like Bos indicus is heat tolerant and parasite resistant, or Bos taurus have good meat quality and good maternal traits. So make sure that you kind of understand the differences between those two. And again, if you have any questions, please stop me, because I'm going to be kind of on a roll. So again, external anatomy, I'm not going to really ask you to like draw that or anything like that. So we talked a little bit about cattle genetics. And so there have been a lot of improvements through cattle genetics, and cattle genetics can help you with sire selection. So sire selection is extremely important because you may end up using one sire for like your entire herd. So you want to make sure that you pick a good one. And so when selecting a sire, that's going to be based on genetics and the heritability of those traits. So the genetic makeup, what kind of genes does the sire have, and then heritability of traits, which is just what is the probability that those traits are actually going to be passed on. Because if the traits are not very heritable, then there's no really guarantee that you're going to see them in the offspring. So those are kind of two key things that you want to look at when you're doing sire selection. Stress is obviously a big thing with a lot of livestock species. There are a lot of things that can cause the animal to be stressed, and that's bad because especially if they're, going to slaughter, you don't want that to affect the meat because it definitely will affect meat quality. And so whenever you're just handling livestock, you need to be aware of things that can cause a stress response. And so we talked about some things that can cause a stress response in cattle, such as ear tagging, branding, dehorning, or tail docking, which is sometimes more done in dairy cattle. So all of those can be very stressful for the animal. So kind of be aware of this slide. So as far as beef reproduction, we talked a little bit about the difference between dairy and beef. So with a dairy farm, what is your main goal? What do you want to produce?
Milk.
Milk, right. And so what's your main goal with a beef farm?
Meat.
Exactly. So those are, pretty simple primary goals. Dairy production wants to focus on milk, so high production cows. And then beef production wants to work on meat and focus on meat production. So you want to have cows that are going to have good meat quality and cows that grow really well. So definitely know the difference between those two goals of those two different types. So cattle are polyestrous, which is a term that you've seen a lot. So polyestrous means what?
Mini cycles.
Right, mini cycles throughout the year. And then you have seasonally polyestrous, which is a version of that, which is only during one season. So make sure you're familiar with that word. So with breeding, we talked about the AM/PM rule, which is something that really stuck with me after my intro class at school because like my teacher just drilled this in us like all the time. So can anybody really basically explain what the AM/PM rule is and kind of what you use it for? Nope. So it's used for breeding cattle. So when you're going to inseminate, you need to figure out when to do that so that you're going to have a chance of success. So if cows are seen in heat in the morning, which is in the AM, when would you inseminate them?
PM.
PM, exactly. Yep. And then it's the same, it's reversed. If they're seen in heat in the afternoon or PM at night, you're going to inseminate them the next AM. So that's what the AM PM rule is about. And it's used to determine when you can breed a cow. So, or heifer. So any questions on the AM PM rule? That will definitely be on your test. So I'll just go ahead and tell you. If you don't understand it, then let me know and I can kind of go over it. Everybody good? Okay. So continuing with cattle reproduction, dystocia is difficulty calving, and that can happen for a lot of different reasons. If the calf is too big, if it's a heifer and she was mated to a sire who typically has calves with larger birth weight. So again, on this slide, bolded, underlined, words that I would definitely like you to know, just good vocabulary terms to kind of get familiar with. Colostrum is what is called the first milk. So that's the first milk that an animal will get. And it is extremely important because it contains antibodies that can actually protect the newborn from disease. Because when they're first born, their immune system is not fully functioning. So they need to get these antibodies from their mom in order to kind of fight off disease until they can develop their own immune system. So definitely know dystocia, know what colostrum is and why it's important, because colostrum is extremely important in all livestock production. I still hear about it in my job almost weekly. So make sure you're familiar with this slide. So we talked about the ruminant digestive system and the 4 compartments. Again, not 4 stomachs like some people tend to believe. It's 4 compartments of one large stomach. And the different compartments are the rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum. And so then we kind of talked about their different functions. I'm not going to ask you to like distinguish them from looking at a picture or anything like that. But the rumen kind of has these little like papillae, and then the reticulum looks like the honeycomb. Omasum kind of looks like a book, and then the abomasum just kind of looks like a regular stomach. So can anybody tell me what the function of the rumen is? What happens there? Where the microbes hang out, they do fermentation of the feedstuffs, and so there's kind of a lot going on in the rumen. So there are a lot of microorganisms that break down things in their feed, the cellulose, which is from plants, to produce volatile fatty acids, which was from your first test. And so those actually can provide energy to the animal. So microbial digestion and fermentation basically is what happens in the rumen. So make sure that you're familiar with that. So in the reticulum, which is the next compartment over, and it's connected to the lumen, is where heavy or really dense feed and metal objects can fall into that compartment. So that'd be a place where you could place magnets, and it would kind of grab that any metal or anything that they eat like that. And then we kind of talked about hardware disease, and that kind of all comes into play in the reticulum because that's where all the heavy material is going to fall. So the omasum contains a lot of folds. It kind of looks like pages in a book, and its primary function is the absorption of liquids. So this section is going to be a little bit bigger in baby animals because they're just drinking liquid, they're drinking milk. So omasum, liquid absorption. And the abomasum is basically the true stomach. So it's the same as the stomach that we have and other non-ruminants have. And so the primary function of the abomasum is chemical digestion. So you can see that's there in bold and underlined again. So obviously I think it's important. So I definitely want you to be able to tell me what the 4 compartments are of a ruminant stomach, and then what is the main function of each one of them. So make sure that you are able to do that, that you know which compartment does what. Okay. So another thing we talked about with cattle was BSE, which is the long word, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. It's a long word to say. So if you know it as BSE, that's completely fine. So it's commonly known as mad cow disease, and it is a fatal neurodegenerative disease in cattle. And it can be transmissible to other cattle through processed animal products from infected animals. And there are regulations in place to prevent BSE. And this is a really big disease that was talked about a lot, especially when it was kind of more prevalent. So be familiar with this slide. So for selection of beef animals, there's been selection for a lot of different things, like for growth, feed efficiency, carcass qualities, and so you can look at DNA markers for desired traits. We talked about body condition score of cattle, which if you didn't get from the first exam, you've probably figured out by now. Body condition score is very important to me, and it's very important if you're going to have any sort of livestock operation. Chickens is probably the only place where it's not as important because they grow so fast and they're all pretty uniform. But for cattle and pigs and sheep, it's pretty important. So body condition score of cattle is extremely important because it helps you with nutritional management. You don't want a cow that's, or any animal, that's too thin or too overweight, because it's also linked to reproductive performance. So make sure you know like why it's important. Nutrition management, and it's linked to reproductive performance. So we talked about a lot of different breeds. I'm not going to ask you like specifics about each of the specific breeds like Angus versus Hereford or anything like that. But I would like you to be familiar with the differences between British breeds and continental breeds. So continental breeds are, British breeds are a lot smaller than continental breeds. So they mature at an earlier age. They have less growth potential, better calving ease because they have smaller calves, and they have lower carcass yield, but better quality. And so the reverse of that, continental breeds like your Charolais and Simmentals and Limousines are larger in mature size. So they mature later because they are larger. So it's going to take them a lot longer to grow. And they have a higher carcass yield, but lower actual grades of their meat. So you have more meat, but it's kind of not as good. And then they may have calving difficulty when mated to cows of, or calving difficulty may occur if you mate them to a cow of a British breed. So if you have like a Charolais sire and you mate that to an Angus heifer, you could have a lot of dystocia problems. So just something to be aware of. So definitely know what the two breeds are, two types of breeds. And some differences between the two. And so I'm not going to ask you any specifics about the different actual, like Charolais versus Hereford versus Angus. So we talked a little bit about dairy farms. It requires a lot of money to start, double the amounts per cow compared to beef. So we talked about dairy management and selecting sires, and how you can do that. And you can do that through artificial insemination, or you can purchase herd sires, or you can actually raise some to be in the herd. So as far as dairy nutrition, kind of a key takeaway that I want you to have is that nutritional requirements must be met. However, during lactation, it is hard to meet the nutritional requirements of that animal because so much energy is being used for milk production that you actually can't meet all of her energy needs. She's going to be pulling it off of her body, and you really can't feed her enough. So that's really the period of dairy cows that's extremely critical with nutrition, because it's very hard to meet their nutritional requirements during lactation. So definitely know that. Also with dairy cattle, we talked about total mixed rations. And so if you've ever been to a dairy farm, or anytime you go to a dairy farm, you'll definitely see this. And basically it's a total mixed ration. So it's a mixture of a bunch of different things. It's got forages, grains, protein feeds, vitamins, minerals, and it can have some feed additives in there too. And so there are benefits and disadvantages to that, but total mixed rations are extremely important, especially in dairy cattle. So make sure you are familiar with this slide. So also with dairy cattle, and it's not specific to dairy cattle, but you typically see it more in dairy cattle, is a problem with mastitis, which is a persistent inflammatory reaction when that udder tissue gets infected. And you can see from that picture there that it's quite a really bad situation. And especially if that gets infected, you don't want a calf getting milk from there, because it's probably just going to be awful, even if there is milk still coming out of there. So it's a really big deal in dairy cattle. So you make sure you want to always keep the udder clean. So be familiar with that disease. I'm not going to ask you the range of body condition scores or anything like that. I just want you to know really why it's important. So does anybody have any questions on beef? That was kind of a long lecture, so it took a little while, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit in the next ones because I want to kind of get through all of them. But you have any questions on beef? Anything I talked about? Okay. And again, I know I'm moving fast, but don't hesitate to stop me, because I want to make sure that I'm kind of answering any questions that y'all have about anything so that you feel comfortable with it. Okay, and now on to pigs, and I will try to speed through this and not get sidetracked because I work with pigs and I love them. Okay, so we talked about a lot of different things with pigs. I'm not going to ask you like anything about the specific breeds of pigs or anything. That's kind of more for your information. So we talked about pig reproduction. Their gestation length is 114 days, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days. And pigs are polyestrous, which again, we've seen a lot. So it means that they cycle all through the year. They have many cycles through the year. So we also talked about the advantage of artificial insemination with pigs and with other livestock. So there are a lot of different advantages. And so one of those is that semen has been checked for quality. So with artificial insemination, you know the semen's been checked for quality. You can select a sire that it has desirable traits that you want. And also you don't always have to keep a sire on site if you are using AI. So definitely lots of advantages to that. So we talked about pig nutrition, of course, and so pigs are monogastrics, which means that they have a simple stomach. So what's the other word that we've talked about that means the same thing as monogastric? Can anybody remember? Non-ruminant, yep. So non-ruminant and monogastric mean the same thing. Obviously, non-ruminant means that they are not a ruminant, they are a monogastric. So make sure you know that those words mean the same thing. Pigs are also omnivores, which means that they eat both meat and plants. They're not limited to either one. And so then obviously you want to formulate their diets based on their stage of production. And typically in the U.S., they're fed a corn soybean meal diet. Because remember, we talked about corn is kind of like the #1 cereal grain that's used. Soybean meal is a close second, especially for pigs. So typically corn and soybean meal diet. We also talked about pig body condition score and why it's important, and it's important for the same reasons it's important in beef cattle and dairy. And then we kind of talked about the different phases of a pig's life. So what is the most stressful event of a pig's life that we talked about? Weaning, right, exactly. When they're taken off their mom and they have to go off of milk and onto a regular dry diet, and then they're mixed with a bunch of animals, it's extremely stressful. So weaning is definitely the most stressful point in a pig's life. So because of this, there are a lot of challenges, and there are basically the stresses we kind of categorize into 3 different types. So there's environmental stress, there's physiological stress, and the social stress that all happen at weaning. So there's those 3 kinds of stress. And so all of those really play a big role in how that pig is going to grow and the health of that animal. So be familiar with this slide. So we talked about the pork industry and kind of how it's structured. So the number of farms that are raising hogs has actually decreased. However, the average number of pigs per farm has increased because you still kind of have to have the same production capacity. So if you have less farms, you're going to have more pigs on the farms that you do have. And so then Iowa is the leading state we talked about. So where does all of the pig production happen in the U.S.? Well, not all, sorry, the majority. What section of the country? Is it the South?
Midwest.
The Midwest, right. And that's because that's where all the corn is. So you don't need to know the top states or anything like that. Just kind of know where it occurs in the U.S., which would be that Midwest area where all the corn is. It's extremely important for pork production. So we talked about genetics and crossbreeding. We also talked about animal waste and the management of manure, and that's extremely important for swine operations because you don't want any of that waste to get into like waterways or anything like that that's going to go to human drinking water. So management of manure that swine produce is extremely critical in the swine industry. Any questions on pigs? All good? Okay. Am I going like way too fast for y'all?
You're fine.
I'm just trying to make sure I like hit on most of it, but I know I'm going pretty fast, but I want to make sure we review all the lectures. So we also talked about sheep and goats.
You already know it all.
Did somebody say something? Question?
Well, I was just saying that they already know it all, so.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. I thought somebody had a question.
Oh.
Hopefully they already know it all. That'd be great. And then I'm just being redundant here. So sheep and goats are both used for meat, milk, fiber, and leather. So lots of different purposes. I'm not going to ask you like how many sheep are in the U.S. or their like classification because that's kind of really hard. Be familiar with terminology for any of the species. Anytime I give you a lot of like vocabulary, kind of know what those terms mean. You probably remember that from exam 1, that you may see these on the test. So sheep are seasonally polyestrous, which I think we all feel comfortable with what that means. They are short day breeders. So remember, horses were long day breeders. So they would come into heat when the days were kind of getting longer. And so sheep are short day breeders. So they breed in the fall. So their lambs are born in the spring. So that's kind of something to be familiar with. And then their nutritional demands increase during late gestation, and that's because that's when the fetus is really, really growing during that last part of gestation. So you want to be aware of that because that's when you want to definitely make sure that you're feeding them enough to meet their nutritional demands. So we talked about puberty and when animals reach puberty, and so age of puberty is determined by a lot of different factors. That could be breed, genetic selection, body size, nutrition, or even the season that they were born in. And so there are a lot of different things that go into that. So make sure that you kind of know some of those, what determines age at puberty. Talked about a lot of different sheep breeds. I'm not going to ask you specifics about each breed. So one term that we did talk about is dual purpose. And so what does that term mean?
Multiple uses.
Right, multiple uses. So they have 2 specific uses. So they could be used for meat and wool, or like, well, I would say with cattle, meat and milk, but that's never really the case. So it's kind of really something that comes into play more with sheep than some of the other livestock species. So it just means that they basically are used for 2 purposes, and meat and wool would be a really good example. So we also talked about mutton, and that means just meat from an adult sheep. So typically that's not going to be something you're going to see in like the grocery store. We would eat lamb, which would be from an animal that's less than a year old. But mutton is the term for meat that comes from a sheep that is older than 1 year. So we talked about sheep nutrition, and sheep, like cattle, are ruminants, which means that they have 4 compartments to their stomach. And so just while we're reviewing, can anybody tell me what the 4 compartments are? So they're ruminants. So they have a,
Is it the same for all rooms?
yep, it is the same for all ruminants.
Okay.
Yep. So ruminants, they have a, what's the compartment where all the microbes are?
Reticulum?
Close. Reticulum's the second one. What's the first
Room?
Rumen, right. So you have the rumen, and then you already said reticulum. And then what's the third one? Has all the folds, looks like a book. Liquid.
Ovocyte? Yeah, ovocyte.
Yep. And then what's the fourth one?
Sorry.
Well, it does start with an A. Kind of sounds like abomasum, right. That's where chemical digestion happens. So those compartments are going to be the same for all ruminants, except later when we get to llamas and alpacas, they actually only have 3 compartments because they're weird. But sheep and cattle are always going to have 4, and they're going to be the same 4. So sheep have a kind of sensitivity, is the word I'm looking for, to copper. Remember, we talked about they need copper, but if they don't have enough, it's a problem, and they can be deficient. But if they have too much, it can be toxic. So can you feed like goat feed to sheep? Anybody remember? If you have goats and sheep together, can you give them the same feed, like from a bag? No. And that's because goats need more copper, and goat feed will have a lot of copper, and it will kill your sheep. So sheep are extremely sensitive to copper. We talked a lot about sheep management and how you kind of want to manage your herd. So different vaccinations, deworming, shearing, lamb care, so docking the tail, and then castration. I'm going to talk about ways to do that. So the important thing that I want you to know is, why do we dock the tail for lambs? And so there's a really important problem that can happen if the tail is not docked, and that's fly strike. So basically that's when flies are attracted to the feces, and then eventually maggots will appear in the wool, and it will be super gross, and that animal probably won't make it unless it's caught super early. So fly strike is in bold and underlined, so chance that that's going to show up. And that's why we dock the tail. So make sure that you know that. Hoof care, we talked about foot rot because it is one of the worst diseases in the sheep industry. So if you have sheep or ever around sheep, it's something you definitely need to be aware of. Again, bolded and underlined. I'm pretty obvious about what I think is important. So this slide definitely go over because it is a really important disease for sheep. And basically it's just an infection that's caused by bacteria that's kind of common in areas with poor sanitation where a lot of bacteria will grow, and the foot will literally start to kind of rot away. So another issue with sheep that we talked about is like predators. So sheep are extremely susceptible to a lot of predators. Sheep don't really have a whole lot of defense mechanism. Like, at least cattle are kind of big and they can kind of like try to stomp things, but sheep just kind of stomp at you, and that's really about all they can do. They can charge you, but they don't have a lot. So they're extremely susceptible to predators. So we talked about a lot of different methods to protect sheep. So those would be like guard dogs, donkeys, or llamas, fencing to try to keep predators out, and then killing or trapping the predators. So lots of different ways that you can try to protect your herd. So we talked a little bit about sheep wool and that it's hair or fur of sheep and goats, and by shearing, and so that's a good management practice. We also talked about transgenic sheep, and transgenic animal is a term that you saw on the first exam, but a lot of people missed it, so very good chance that it's going to show up again on this exam. So a transgenic animal is just one where the gene of another organism has been inserted into the genetic material of another animal. So transgenic animal because it has a gene that's kind of been transferred into its genome, is kind of the way I think about it. So this is extremely important with sheep because there's been a lot of genetic technology that's been kind of looked at with sheep, and a sheep was actually the first mammal that was cloned from adult cells. So that's kind of important. I remember in my classes, we always talked about Dolly, who was like the first cloned sheep. So make sure you know that sheep was the first mammal to be cloned. So just like sheep, goats are seasonally polyester short day breeders. We talked about the different breeds and what their specific qualities are. Goats are also ruminants, so they have the same 4 compartments: rumen, reticulum, omasum, abomasum. So one thing that kind of sticks out with goat nutrition is that goats require a higher quality diet than cattle do. And this is because their digestive tract is a lot smaller with respect to how much energy they need. So they need a lot of energy for their body size, and so they have to have a higher quality diet than cattle do so that they can meet their energy needs. And of course, like we talked about, their diets contain copper, so don't feed them to sheep. Any questions on sheep and goats? Okay. All right, so then we talked about some alternative mammalian livestock, so buffaloes, llamas, and alpacas, rabbits, and deer. So we talked about buffalo and lots of different qualities that they have and that they actually were almost extinct, but now they're back. I probably mentioned in the lecture that you watched that my great uncle actually has a bison farm in Mecklenburg County, well, kind of bordering Mecklenburg and Lunenburg County. So I have been around them a little bit, and they're pretty cool animals, very temperamental and a little more intense than cattle. But so bison terminology, pretty similar to regular cattle. A cow is going to be an adult female, bull is your adult male, calf is a young animal, and then calving is the process of giving birth. So we did talk about bison can withstand temperatures better than domestic cattle. So they're probably a little more resistant to parasites, and they can withstand heat a little bit better because they're typically, I think of them as a little bit more wild and not as domesticated as cattle. And so because of that, I feel like they're a little bit hardier and they can survive in different climates. So bison meat is actually pretty healthy. It's pretty low in fat and high in protein. I actually really like it. It's just really expensive. But if you're trying to be a little bit on the healthier side, bison meat is a little better for you than typical beef. So we talked a little bit about bison reproduction and how big they get. And with good management, the cows should reproduce every year. They can live to be quite old, actually, 30 years or older. And one bull can typically breed about 10 to 15 cows. And so that's kind of, you want to kind of figure out how many you need per pasture or something like that, depending on how it's set up, based on how many cows you have. And they usually calve with ease, which again, I think is kind of from them being a little less domesticated than cattle. They kind of over time needed to evolve to be able to have calves with very little intervention from people. Whereas if you think about cows, sometimes they need a little assistance. So we talked about different ways that you can manage a bison herd and breed them. Artificial insemination is an option, but because they are a lot more temperamental than cattle, natural breeding methods are probably the way to go because they can be very unpredictable. So we also talked about young bulls should be brought into the herd every 3 years, and that is to produce inbreeding. Because if you don't have a very large herd and you're using the same bull, and then all of a sudden all of the babies that are born are his sons or daughters, eventually after about 3 years, you're going to start running into some inbreeding problems. So you kind of want to rotate and bring in a new bull every 3 years to kind of prevent that inbreeding problem. So they can be vaccinated as cattle are, but they do have stronger immune systems than cattle, again, because they've had to learn how to survive kind of in the wild before people actually really started keeping them on farms. Actually, that's a picture from my great uncle's farm. That's one of his bulls. And I thought he was kind of cute, so I took a picture. So, but basically, they have stronger immune systems than cattle, and so they can adapt to a wide range of environments, feed sources, and management systems. They are ruminants, so same as cattle and sheep, they have those same 4 compartments. And so you want to make sure that you have a good grazing program that allows you to make the most of your pasture. So definitely when you have buffalo, a strong containment system is essential. You want to make sure that they're not going to get out, because if they get out, they're going to be extremely hard to get. So there are a lot of ways you can keep them in. We talked about the water buffalo is kind of a distantly related relative, and it's a major milk producing species in India. If you think back to earlier lectures, in the first sections, we talked about how India is the #1 milk producing country, and part of that is because of the water buffalo. So llamas and alpacas are typically used as pack animals. They can also be used to protect sheep. So they're used as guard animals. Llamas are bigger than alpacas. People always kind of get confused on which one's which. So just you can kind of see from this picture that they look a little bit different, and llamas are going to be a lot taller and kind of have like a little bit of a rougher coat. I think alpacas, they typically have a coat that kind of looks a little more like a sheep to me. But llamas are also jerks. I've been completely spit on, like covered by llama spit one time when I worked at a zoo. So I'm not the biggest fan of llamas. So llamas and alpacas are seasonal breeders, and they are induced ovulators. So can anybody tell me what that means?
They don't ovulate until after they've already been bred.
Yep, exactly. So they're only going to ovulate. They're not going to kind of ovulate like on a schedule or on a cycle. They're going to ovulate only after they've been bred. And we talked about this in the first section. There's another animal that's a companion animal that's also an induced ovulator. Does anybody remember what it is?
Cats.
Cats, yep. So it's kind of weird. You don't think of alpacas and llamas and cats having anything in common, but they're all induced ovulators. And so that means that they will ovulate after they've been bred and only after they've been bred. So a little bit about their digestive system. They are very similar to ruminants, but they have 3 compartments instead of 4. So we kind of call them like a modified ruminant. And so basically you can kind of see on this picture that their compartment 1 is what the C stands for. So you have compartment 1, compartment 2, and compartment 3. Compartment 1 is probably like a combination of the rumen and reticulum, but kind of together in like one big section, and then you're going to kind of have the other compartments. So they are a little bit weird, which is why they're called modified ruminants, because they have 3 compartments instead of 4. They have few disease problems. Of course, you want to have a deworming schedule just like you would with sheep and cattle. The care can be important. Then we also talked about rabbits, because some people keep rabbits as pets, and they can be raised for different purposes. So rabbits are herbivores, which mean that they just eat plants. They don't eat meat. So that's why they're herbivores, and they're simple stomached animals, so that they are non-ruminant monogastrics. And they have a large cecum, which is the hindgut where a lot of fermentation occurs. So they are what we call hindgut fermenters. And does anybody remember the other animal that we talked about previously that's a hindgut fermenter, all the way back from exam 1? It's a really big animal. Tom has one.
A horse.
Horse, yep. So again, it's kind of like llamas, alpacas, and cats. They're all induced ovulators. You wouldn't think that a horse and a rabbit would have anything in common, but actually horses and rabbits are both hindgut fermenters. So a lot of that fermentation occurs in the hindgut in the cecum. So that's just something to kind of be aware of. Also, in order to more fully utilize fiber from plants and what they eat, rabbits will actually practice coprophagy, and that is where they will actually eat their own feces again. Because when everything is passed through, they're not super efficient at digesting it, so there are still a lot of nutrients left over once they've excreted it, and so they will actually eat it again, and it'll go for round 2. So that they're not wasting nutrients. It's really, really gross, but some animals do that. So that's called coprophagy. And I didn't bold and underline that term, but hint, hint, you may want to know what that means. So rabbits eat a lot of different things. Like I said, they're herbivores, so it's all going to be plant-based. We also talked about deer farming, which is obviously like not a huge thing, but some people do have deer that they actually farm. And deer are susceptible to chronic wasting disease, which is a disease that's also caused by something similar to what causes mad cow disease. Any questions on alternative mammals? Edwin? Okay, so then we also talked about chickens and other poultry. So there are a lot of things about poultry that are different from other species that we've talked about. So their biology has a lot of unique features. So that would be the absence of teeth, which is a big one. They have feathers, which we haven't talked about any other ones that have feathers. They have different skeletal and muscular requirements needed for flight because they're the only livestock species we talked about that can fly. They also have the presence of internal testes in the male. They're not outside of the body like they are in most other species. And then, of course, they have adaptations for egg-laying capabilities in the female. So be familiar with this slide and be able to tell me a couple of things that are different about birds and poultry in general compared to some of the other species that we've talked about. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but be familiar with this terminology. It's just always good to know like basic vocabulary and terms for all the species that we're talking about. So a hen is going to be your adult female. A rooster is going to be an adult male. A capone is a castrated chicken. And then tom is adult male turkey. Chick is a newly hatched chicken, and so on and so forth. Just be familiar with those. I'm not going to really ask you too much about the domestication because I feel like that's kind of a lot. I'd rather you kind of know more of the practical application stuff and how to actually raise them if you have them and what's kind of unique about them. So we talked a little bit about external anatomy of the rooster and how you can tell a rooster from a hen. So they have what are called secondary sex characteristics. And so there are several of those that roosters have. So what would be some things that roosters have that a hen doesn't? Comb, right? On the top of their head, you're going to see that large red comb with something else. Wattle, right? So like right at their neck, you can see on the picture. And then spurs are another thing kind of on the back of their feet that you can see. So pretty easy to distinguish a rooster from a hen once they're both mature. So definitely be able to kind of tell me a few things that we just talked about and how you'll be able to tell it's a rooster. So with poultry production, we talked about broiler breeders, which are the parent stock for the production of meat chickens. We also talked about something that's pretty cool with birds, which is photostimulation. So that means that they become reproductively mature when they're exposed to day lengths. So they are stimulated by like photo, which kind of means light from the sun, basically. So be familiar with that term and know what that means and know which species that we were talking about. So a little bit more about reproduction. Do hens have to mate with a rooster in order to produce an egg?
No.
No, right. So it's kind of something weird, like you would kind of think like that they would. That's kind of what your first thought would be, I feel like. But they actually do not need to mate with a rooster in order to produce an egg. In order for that egg to be fertilized and for you to get a chick, they have to have. But in order to just get an egg, you don't. The hens will keep producing eggs no matter what. So we talked a little bit about caponization or caponization, however you want to say it. And that is basically just the removal of the testes or castration of a male chicken. And it's extremely rare today because there have been a lot of improvements in poultry growth rates and meat quality, and also labor concerns. People don't want to have to do this anymore. So it's not typically practiced. We also talked about the poultry digestive system and how it's kind of different from other animals. So you have the crop where food is kind of stored in case they need to like take off and fly somewhere. And then you have the proventriculus, which is going to be like their regular stomach, similar to ours. The gizzard is basically a really large muscle, and that's where a lot of muscular digestion is going to happen. And then you have the small intestine and so on and so forth. So poultry are monogastrics, so they are similar to pigs and humans other than kind of the little modifications of their digestive system with the gizzard and the crop, which obviously humans and pigs don't have, but they do have one simple stomach. Methionine is the important amino acid that's needed for feather production. So basically, amino acids just make up protein, and protein is really important. And different amino acids are more important for different species. So methionine is one that's really important for birds, and it's important because they have feathers. So other animals have different ones that are important because they don't have feathers. So just kind of a little fun fact there. So obviously corn is a major feed ingredient as well. Genetic selection with birds has obviously led to increased growth rates, increase in a number of eggs that are produced, and feed efficiency. So there are a lot of different things that genetic selection can kind of help with, but those are really the main three when it comes to poultry. So we talked about all the different breeds, which I'm not going to really ask you to specific things about each breed. We also talked about something that is very popular with poultry production. Other livestock systems are kind of starting to go more this way, but poultry has kind of really been at the forefront of this. So poultry production is typically vertically integrated. And so basically what that means is that there is a combination in one company of two or more stages of production. So one company will own at least two or more parts of that production. So that could mean that like Tyson, for example, owns the chickens, they probably own the hatchery, and then they also would own the processing plant or the feed mill. So any two or more components of that they own, the better, because it kind of helps you streamline everything and it makes it a lot easier. When the same company owns the feed mill as has the animals, it makes it a lot easier for you to get things done. Because we have a farm actually that I work with that does not own their own feed mill for their pigs, and it's a constant battle because they think the feed mill is charging them too much money, but they have to do what the feed mill says because they need the feed mill because they don't own one. So with poultry, it's a lot better and it's a lot more efficient if one company owns several stages or even all stages of production. And some of the big players like Tyson probably do own pretty much every stage of this production. So meat chickens and turkeys are typically raised on deep litter, and that's for several different reasons. It can help with bird health by absorbing water that's spilled over from the waterers and from any of their excretions. And litter can be made out of really different things. It can be wood shaving, sawdust, ground straw, or other fibrous materials. Yusuf, what do y'all use for?
We use wood shavings.
Wood shavings? Okay. Yeah, that's typically a pretty popular one. But yeah, it's really good for to help with their health, because you don't want a bunch of like moist areas around, because that's just going to be a breeding bacteria or breeding ground for bacteria. Okay, so I think that's kind of the highlights of the poultry lecture. Any questions on poultry and chickens? I mean, chickens are poultry, but chickens are kind of like the standalone one, so it's kind of just chickens and other poultry. Does anybody have any questions? All good? And again, if you think of any questions afterwards, between now and the exam or at any time really, feel free to email me. I check my email pretty frequently, so if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking or you just don't like to speak in class, feel free to email me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And then aquaculture should be pretty fresh in your mind since you just had that lecture at the end of last week. It was a super short lecture because it's not a very long one. But we talked about kind of why there is a need for aquaculture. So there are two different reasons why there's a really big need for aquaculture, and those are growing consumer demand for fish-type products, and then the problem of overfishing are both two big things that are kind of driving the need for aquaculture. We talked about fish farms, which I think are kind of cool. We also talked about fish nutrition. They don't have all the digestive components, so they have a very short digestive system. And so because of this, they require very high quality feed with easily digestible proteins. So any protein that they eat has to be very easily digestible in order for them to get all of the nutrients out of it in the short amount of time that it's going to be in their digestive tract. So definitely know that they require high quality feed with easily digestible proteins. They're very efficient at putting on gain from however much feed that they eat. So we also talked about the fact that some fish are hermaphrodites, which is actually like pretty cool. I just think everything on this slide about fish is very, very interesting. So hermaphrodites basically, and this can happen with any species actually, by the way, it's not just fish. Fish just it's way more common. So some have both male and female sex organs and characteristics, so they can produce both sperm and eggs. So be familiar with that term and what that means because it's important when you talk about fish. And then sequential hermaphrodites are just kind of a version of that where they actually start off as one sex and then they can switch to the other if the need arises. And I just think that's super cool. So there are a lot of health benefits of consuming fish. The big one that we talked about was the omega-3 fatty acids. And fish are really the only food that can supply large amounts of this. And there are many benefits of omega-3 fatty acids that we talked about, such as cutting risk of heart attack and stroke, and elevating mood and helping people think. So omega-3 fatty acids are kind of the really big player and reason why people want to eat a lot of fish. So on the flip side of that, there are risks associated with eating fish, and the big one that we talked about is the presence of mercury. So some fish are really, really high in mercury, and mercury can really harm the nervous system of fetuses especially. So that's why pregnant women should really avoid a lot of seafood. Okay, so that's kind of my wrap up on the review. Does anybody have any questions? I know I ask that a lot. Anything that you feel like you're not comfortable with that you saw in the lectures as we went through? Anything that I kind of pointed out that you don't feel like you understand or you need a better way to remember it? Any questions? So the test is going to be the same format as exam 1. However, on this one, there may be a few questions where I kind of give you 2 words to choose from. It'll be a fill in the blank, but I'll give you 2 words there to choose from, and then you just choose the correct one. Or then there's some where you have like a little hint to kind of help you. And also this one's going to have 3 extra credit questions. I'm really having trouble talking today. So you will have a chance for 3 extra points on this one. It'll be 3 questions for a point each. And again, same format. You'll have the whole class period to take it. Online students, you're going to have a week to take it starting from this Wednesday until the following Wednesday. It'll be open. Again, I have not heard from anybody about a change in proctor situation. Have you heard from anybody, Tom?
No.
Okay, so I'm assuming that everybody online is taking it at a designated proctor location, and those people will have the passwords sent out to them. Tom, did you want me to send the passwords this time, or are you going to send them again, or what do you want to do?
Either way.
Okay, I don't mind sending them. Did you ever send me the contacts?
I'll try to send you that here this afternoon.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, if you send that to me, I can email that over. Whatever's easier for you. And
So the test is Wednesday?
the test is Wednesday.
Okay.
Yep. The test is Wednesday. Definitely take a look at the study guide. And then everybody should have submitted their livestock production assignment. So if you haven't, it's going to be late, but go ahead and still submit that. And I'll grade those as soon as I can. But yeah, so with that, good luck studying. Tom, the test is ready whenever you need to print it off.
Yes, I just saw that email.